I was standing 3 feet behind General Patton when he looked at something that should not have existed. And I need you to understand one thing before I go any further. I am not a man who exaggerates, never have been. My Catherine, God rest her, used to say, "Edward, you are the most boring, honest man I have ever met in my life." She meant it as a compliment. So when I tell you what I saw in that room, know that it is coming from the most boring, honest man you will ever hear from. My name is Edward Malone, corporal, United States Army, 3rd Army, General Patton's personal security detail, November and December, 1945. I am 98 years old, and I have been carrying this thing alone for 80 years. I joined the Army in 1942, 19 years old, skinny kid from Pittsburgh, not particularly brave, not particularly special. I was just a man who went quiet when everything around him went loud, who got still when others panicked. Somewhere in France, in the summer of 1944, an officer noticed that quality. 3 weeks later, I was pulled from my unit and assigned to stand 3 feet behind the most famous general in the American military. So that is what I did. I stood close to Patton in France, in Luxembourg, in the drive across Germany that people are still writing books about. I stood close to him when he was brilliant, and when he was reckless, which was most of the time. I stood close to him when he wept, privately, at the sight of what the Germans had done in the camps. Wept with his jaw set, and his hands rigid at his sides, the way a man cries when he has decided he is allowed to cry, but not allowed to fall apart. I knew him, the way a shadow knows a man, not as a friend. Generals don't make friends with corporals, but I could read him, the way sailors read weather. I knew when the storm was coming. I knew when it had passed. I knew the specific quality of the silence. That meant something was wrong. In November of 1945, something was very wrong. The war had been over for 6 months. Patton had been reassigned to a desk job, running the 15th Army, essentially a historical documentation unit, a way of keeping him busy, while politicians sorted out what post-war Europe was going to look like. He hated it. But that was not what was wrong with him in November. Visitors had started coming, quiet men, in civilian clothes, who arrived without announcement and left the same way, who sat with Patton behind closed doors for hours at a time, and who left him, every single time, visibly shaken. Now I need you to understand what I mean. When I say Patton was shaken, this was a man who walked toward incoming artillery fire to get a better look at a tactical situation, while everyone around him was diving for cover. The concept of ordinary human fear operated differently in him than in the rest of us. But after those meetings, he ate less. He stood at windows for long periods, looking at nothing, with an expression I had never seen on his face before. I have the word for it now. He was frightened. On the morning of November 18th, 1945, I was told to prepare for an inspection. No details, no location, no briefing of any kind. Just be ready. 4 vehicles, 8 men. Within the hour, we drove south from Bad Nauheim for nearly 3 hours, into Bavaria, into bare November countryside. That felt like the end of the world. Patton did not speak for the entire drive. Sat completely still, somewhere else entirely. The road we eventually turned onto was not on any map I had been given. A narrow track through dense forest, climbing into the lower slopes of a mountain, whose name nobody told me. The vehicle struggled, and at a certain point we stopped and continued on foot, through trees so thick the sky disappeared. After 40 minutes of walking, we arrived at what appeared to be a rock face. I want you to hold that word, appeared, because a German civilian I had not seen before that morning walked to a specific point on that rock face, pressed against it in a particular way, and a section of it opened silently. No grinding, no drama, just solid rock swinging inward on a mechanism so perfectly engineered it made no sound at all. Behind it, a corridor lit with electric light descending into the mountain. Patton stood at the entrance. Then he turned and looked directly at me. He said, "Stay close, Malone." I said, "Yes, sir," and we went in. The corridor was smooth concrete, perhaps 200 meters long. The air had the flat, recycled quality of somewhere that had never been outside. And underneath that, a smell, chemical, faintly metallic, the kind of smell that makes the back of your throat feel wrong before your brain understands why. At the bottom, a heavy steel door. The civilian produced a key. The lock turned, and I walked into the largest room I have ever stood in underground. I am going to be precise about this room, because I owe it that. I have owed it 80 years. It was enormous. 3 aircraft hangars side by side, ceiling 30 feet above, everything smooth concrete, and the lighting came from fixtures overhead. That left no shadows anywhere in the room. No shadows. I noticed that immediately. We expect shadows. They are the proof that light is real. A room with no shadows feels wrong in a way I cannot fully explain. Along the left wall, long metal workbenches covered in components. And I need you to understand, I was not a technical man, but I had spent 2 years in a mechanized army. I knew what manufactured things looked like. I knew the logic of how metal is cut and shaped and joined. The components on those workbenches did not follow that logic. The geometry was wrong, the way surfaces curved, the way edges met, the way certain pieces terminated. None of it followed any manufacturing logic I had ever encountered. It was as if someone had replaced the rules of how things are built with different rules entirely. Rules I did not know. Along the right wall, filing cabinets, dozens of them, and beside them, wooden crates, some open, filled with thousands of pages of technical drawings, dense mathematical notation, equations so small and precise, they looked almost mechanical. I looked at those equations and understood nothing, and had the strange feeling that understanding them would have changed me permanently. Then I looked at the center of the room, and I stopped walking. It was large, perhaps 40 feet across, circular, resting on metal supports, 4 feet off the floor. The surface was dark, a gray so deep it was almost black, and smooth in a way I had no reference for. Not like polished metal, not like glass. Something outside those categories entirely. And it did not reflect light. It absorbed it. Every other surface in that room reflected light. That is what surfaces do. That is how we see things. This did not. It absorbed the light that hit it, so that looking at it directly was like looking at a hole in the room, like someone had cut a circular shape out of reality and left only the absence. Patton walked toward it, slowly, stopped 6 feet away, hands behind his back. The posture he used when thinking through a tactical problem, he stood there for 2 full minutes, without speaking. The room was completely silent. 8 soldiers, 2 civilians, all of us watching the most famous general in the American military stand 6 feet from something that should not have existed. Then he said, quietly, almost to himself, "How long have they had it?" One of the civilians, a thin man in a gray suit named Richard, stepped forward. He said, "Our best assessment is that it was recovered in early 1944 from a crash site in the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest, a special SS unit operating directly under Himmler. Recovered it. It was transported here in sections. Reassembly was completed 8 months before the end of the war," Patton said, "and it was operational," Richard said. "The propulsion mechanism was never fully understood, but certain other systems were reverse engineered successfully. What you see on those workbenches incorporates principles derived from studying this craft, principles anywhere from 20 to 200 years ahead of anything we currently possess." Patton was quiet. Then he said, "And the crew?" Richard paused. 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds felt like a long time. He said, 2 individuals were recovered from the crash site. One did not survive the recovery. The second survived for approximately 11 weeks. In German custody, Patton said. "Where?" Richard said. "There is a secondary facility 30 kilometers from here. The documentation from those 11 weeks is extensive. We are still working through the translation, but what we have read so far is deeply troubling. I want you to sit with that 11 weeks. Whatever came out of that craft lived for 11 weeks in German custody. and produced enough documentation to fill crates, and whatever was in those documents was deeply troubling to men who had spent 6 years processing the most troubling events in human history. Patton turned from the object and looked directly at Richard. He said, "Who else knows?" Richard said, "On the American side, fewer than 20 people. The President, the Joint Chiefs, a small number of scientific advisors. The circle has been kept tight." Patton said, "The Russians," Richard said. "We believe they have recovered something similar in the Eastern Territories. We do not know the extent of what they understand." Patton nodded slowly. He said, "What do you want from me?" Richard said, "General, we need your assessment of the strategic implications. You are the finest military mind of this generation. What is sitting in this room changes every calculation we have ever made. We need to understand what that means. From someone who thinks the way you think." Patton turned back to the object. He was quiet for a long time, a very long time. Then he said the 7 words. "The 7 words I have carried in my chest for 80 years. He said, "It means we cannot keep this secret." Richard said, "General," Patton said, "the American people and every other people on this earth have a right to know what is sitting in this room. Every decision made by every government on this planet from this point forward will be made on a false foundation unless we tell the truth. I have spent my entire career fighting for the proposition that free men deserve to know what they are fighting for and why." "This is no different," Richard said. "General Patton, I strongly advise." Patton said, "I did not ask for your advice." He turned around and looked directly at me for the first time that entire day, and I saw in his eyes not the frightened man I had been watching for 2 weeks, but the general, the force of nature, that walked toward artillery fire. He said, "You heard all of that, Malone?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Good. Remember it." I said, "Yes, sir." 1 more second of that gaze. Then he turned and walked toward the door. I followed him, 3 feet behind, the same as always. 17 days later, he was dead. We drove back to Bad Nauheim in silence, 3 hours, and I want you to understand what that silence felt like, because it was not ordinary silence. It was not the silence of tired men on a long drive. It was the silence of people who have all seen the same thing and are all separately trying to decide what that thing means for everything they thought they knew. I sat in the vehicle behind Patton's, watching the back of his head through the windshield. He did not move for the entire journey, did not turn to speak to anyone, did not look out the window, just sat completely still. When we arrived back at headquarters, Patton went directly to his private office. He did not come out for 6 hours. I stood my post outside that door for 6 hours, and I listened to silence. No phone calls, no dictation, no movement of any kind, just the complete absence of sound from behind a closed door, from a man who was never silent, from a man whose energy filled every room he entered. That silence frightened me more than anything I had seen in the mountain, because I understood what it meant. It meant the general was making a decision, and decisions that took 6 hours of silence from George Patton were not small decisions. When he finally emerged, it was past midnight. He said, "Malone, how long have you been standing there?" I said, 6 hours, sir." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You are a good soldier. In 18 months of standing 3 feet behind this man," he had never said that to me. Not once. He was not a man who distributed compliments casually. Those 5 words landed with a weight I could feel, but not explain. I understand the weight now. He went to bed. I went to my bunk. I lay there looking at the ceiling, and I thought about a 40-foot circular object that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, and 2 individuals recovered from a crash site in the Black Forest, one of whom had survived for 11 weeks. I did not sleep. On the 4th day after the facility, the civilian men came back. Just Richard and the nameless one. They arrived without announcement and went directly into Patton's office. And for the first time in my entire service on his detail, I heard Patton raise his voice behind a closed door during a meeting with civilians. I could not make out the words. The door was too heavy, but I could hear the cadence of it, the rhythm of an argument, Patton's voice rising, dropping, rising again, with that particular quality his voice had when he was being contradicted by someone he considered beneath contradiction. Then a long silence. Then the nameless man, speaking quietly. For a very long time. They were in there for 2 hours. When they left, they did not look at me as they passed. People who are comfortable look at you when they pass, even just a glance. They acknowledge that you exist. These men did not look at me. I knocked on Patton's door. He said, "Come." I went in. He was standing at the window, looking out at the gray November sky, hands clasped behind his back. He did not turn when I entered. He said, "Malone, if something happens to me." I said, "Sir." He said, "I'm not being dramatic. I am being practical. If something happens to me, I want you to remember what you saw in that room. Not for any official purpose. Just keep it. The way you keep something that belongs to someone who is gone." I said, "Nothing is going to happen to you, sir." He said, "You have been a fine soldier, Malone. Whatever comes next, I want you to know that." He turned from the window and looked at me directly, and I saw in his face something I have never seen before or since in any man. It was not fear. It was not resignation. It was the expression of a man who has looked at every available option, made his choice, and found a kind of peace in the making of it. The expression of a man who has decided that the truth is worth whatever the truth costs. He said, "That will be all." I said, "Yes, sir." I left the room. That was the last real conversation I ever had with him. 6 days later, on the morning of December 9th, 1945, General George S. Patton was traveling in his staff car on a road outside Mannheim, heading to a pheasant hunting trip. A normal Sunday morning, the official account states that an American military truck, traveling in the opposite direction, made a sudden left turn and struck the Cadillac at low speed. I need you to stay with me on that detail. Low speed. The collision was described in every official document as a minor low-speed impact, the kind that dents fenders and sends everyone home shaken but unharmed. Yet Patton, sitting in the back seat of an armored staff car, suffered a catastrophic cervical spine injury, instantaneous, complete paralysis from the neck down. The driver of the truck was unhurt. General Hobart Gay, sitting right beside Patton in the same vehicle, was unhurt. Only Patton, in a low-speed collision in an armored vehicle, suffered an injury so specific, so catastrophic, so precisely located, that it ended the life of the most physically resilient soldier of his generation. I have thought about the physics of that for 80 years. The driver of the truck was a man named Robert Thompson. He gave a statement to investigators and then disappeared. No further military records, no civilian records that any researcher has ever been able to locate. A man present at one of the most consequential moments in American military history simply ceased to exist. On paper, people do not simply cease to exist on paper unless someone helps them. My assignment to Patton's detail was terminated the same day as the accident. I was given new orders within hours of the crash, before anyone knew whether he was going to survive. I want you to hold that. Before anyone knew whether Patton would live or die, someone had already prepared my reassignment paperwork. That does not happen by accident. On December 21st, 1945, I was told that General George S. Patton had died in the night. I sat on the edge of my bunk, and I did not move. For a very long time, I went home to Pittsburgh. I married Catherine. I worked the mill for 30 years. I raised 3 children. I lived the quiet life of a man who came home from war and was grateful for the coming home. And every night, without exception, I thought about a room underneath a Bavarian mountain. In 1962, I wrote a letter to a journalist. I described the facility, the object, the conversation, the civilian men, the reassignment orders that arrived before anyone knew if Patton would survive. I wrote all of it down. Then I sat with that letter for 3 days. On the 3rd day, a Tuesday evening, while Catherine was inside making dinner, I burned it in the backyard. I have asked myself every day since whether that was the right decision. In 1979, a former OSS officer named Douglas Bazata gave a series of public interviews